Documentation forms the foundation of nursing practice. Every vital sign, every medication administration, every patient interaction must be recorded with precision and accuracy. In my 8 years of night shift nursing at Community General Hospital, I had maintained meticulous records, understanding that patient safety depends on clear, consistent documentation. That's why the entries in my logbook that I never wrote became so disturbing. I discovered the first anomalous entry during my Thursday morning review. Standard practice required checking the previous night's documentation before leaving the hospital, ensuring all required information was properly recorded and signed. But my logbook contained vital signs for a patient I had never assessed. Room 237, Bed B. Matthews, George. 0200 hours. Temperature 98.6 degrees. Blood pressure 120/80. Heart rate 72. Respiration 16. Patient resting comfortably. K. Sullivan, RN. My signature, my handwriting, proper medical abbreviations. But I had no memory of caring for George Matthews, and room 237B had been empty throughout my shift. I checked the patient census to verify the room assignments. Room 237B was listed as unoccupied, scheduled for cleaning after the previous patient's discharge 2 days earlier. No George Matthews appeared anywhere in the hospital's admission records. "Did we have a late admission last night?" I asked Maria, the charge nurse. She reviewed her overnight log. "No admissions after 10 p.m. Why?" I showed her the entry in my documentation. "I have vital signs recorded for a patient in 237B, but I don't remember seeing anyone there." Maria examined the handwriting carefully. "That's your signature, Karen. Your documentation style. Are you sure you didn't check on someone in that room?" But I was certain. I had made my rounds systematically, visiting each occupied room according to the census list. Room 237B had been empty, dark, and locked throughout the night. "Maybe you recorded the wrong room number?" Maria suggested. "Sometimes when you're tired, it's easy to transpose numbers." I checked my other entries, looking for missing vital signs that might have been accidentally recorded under the wrong room. But all my documented patients matched my memories of the night's activities. Only George Matthews remained unexplained. That evening, I paid special attention to room 237B during my rounds. Empty bed, lights off, no patient belongings or medical equipment. The room remained unoccupied according to both the census and my direct observation. But when I reviewed my logbook at the end of the shift, another entry had appeared. Room 237B, Matthews, George. 021 fem hours. Temperature 98.4 degrees. Blood pressure 118/78. Heart rate 74. Respirations 18. Patient reports mild discomfort, repositioned for comfort. K. Sullivan, RN. Again, my handwriting. Again, a patient I had never seen in a room that remained empty. But this entry included additional details: patient repositioning, comfort measures, clinical observations that suggested direct patient interaction. I had no memory of writing those words or providing that care. Dr. Peterson, our night physician, was concerned when I reported the documentation discrepancies. "Karen, are you experiencing any memory problems? Unusual fatigue or confusion?" "I feel fine. Alert, focused, no different than usual. But I'm documenting care for patients who don't exist." Dr. Peterson suggested I might be experiencing early signs of burnout or sleep deprivation. Night shift can be demanding. Sometimes our minds fill in details automatically, especially with routine tasks. But the George Matthews entries continued appearing in my logbook night after night. Always room 237B, always during the early morning hours, always documenting appropriate nursing care for a patient I couldn't locate. After a week of impossible documentation, I decided to stay awake specifically to observe room 237B during the times when my logbook showed patient assessments. If I was somehow caring for George Matthews without remembering, I wanted to witness it happening. At 2:01 a.m., I positioned myself at the nurses' station with a clear view of room 237B. The room remained dark and empty. I watched continuously for 30 minutes, never leaving my post, never taking my eyes off the empty room. But when I checked my logbook at 2:30 a.m., a new entry had appeared. Room 237B, Matthews George. 0200 hours. Temperature 98.8 degrees. Blood. Pressure 125/82. Heart rate 76. Respirations 20. Patient appears restless. Administered comfort measures. Daughter visited briefly. K. Sullivan, RN. Written in my handwriting while I sat watching the empty room where no patient existed and no daughter could have visited. The entries became more detailed over time. George Matthews apparently had diabetes requiring blood sugar monitoring. He expressed concerns about his upcoming surgery. He appreciated the extra blanket I had provided. He asked about his medication schedule, all documented in my careful handwriting, describing interactions that never occurred with a patient who didn't exist. But the most disturbing aspect was the pattern that emerged after 2 weeks of impossible documentation. Every entry for George Matthews was followed within 24 hours by the death of a real patient with similar medical conditions. After documenting George Matthews's concerns about diabetes, Mr. Rodriguez in room 215 died from diabetic complications. After recording George's anxiety about surgery, Mrs. Patterson in room 309 died during a routine procedure. After noting George's appreciation for comfort measures, Mr. Davis in room 198 died peacefully during sleep. The correlation was too consistent to ignore. My phantom documentation for a non-existent patient seemed to predict actual deaths among my real patients. I brought this pattern to Dr. Peterson's attention, showing him weeks of logbook entries paired with subsequent patient deaths. It's like George Matthews is experiencing the symptoms and concerns of patients who are about to die. Dr. Peterson studied the documentation carefully. Karen, this is unusual, but correlation doesn't imply causation. These could be coincidences. 17 coincidences in 3 weeks? He had no explanation for the pattern, but he was clearly concerned about my mental state. I think you should consider taking some time off. Talk to a counselor. These documentation issues might indicate stress that you're not consciously recognizing, but I didn't feel stressed. I felt confused and frightened by documentation that was appearing in my own handwriting without my knowledge or memory. I decided to test the phenomenon directly. If my logbook was somehow predicting patient deaths through impossible entries, I wanted to see if the pattern could be interrupted. When my logbook showed George Matthews reporting chest pain and shortness of breath, I immediately identified the real patients with cardiac risk factors and implemented additional monitoring. Mr. Thompson in room 204 matched the symptoms profile, so I arranged for continuous cardiac observation. Mr. Thompson died of a heart attack 6 hours later. Despite the enhanced monitoring, the George Matthews entries continued, and the real patient deaths followed with mechanical precision. My phantom documentation was creating an accurate record of symptoms and concerns that would soon manifest in actual patient deaths. After a month of impossible entries, I requested a transfer to day shift, hoping to escape whatever was causing my logbook to document care for patients who existed only on paper. But the day shift supervisor called me 3 days later. Karen, we need to discuss your documentation. You're recording vital signs for patients during hours when you're not scheduled to work. Even on day shift, my logbook was accumulating entries for George Matthews during overnight hours when I was home in bed. The phantom documentation continued independently of my presence in the hospital. I eventually left Community General Hospital and accepted a position at a different facility across town. But sometimes I wonder if George Matthews is still receiving documented care in room 237B, his vital signs recorded by nurses who have no memory of providing that care. And I wonder if those impossible entries still predict real deaths, if some patients exist only as warnings written in handwriting that doesn't belong to the people who seem to write it. Some documentation, I've learned, serves purposes beyond medical record keeping. Sometimes our logbooks record information that we need to know but couldn't obtain through normal observation, creating impossible entries that document the care patients receive in the spaces between life and death. And sometimes the most accurate nursing notes are the ones we never remember writing, documenting patients who exist only as harbingers of losses. We can document, but cannot prevent. Hospital ventilation systems create their own acoustic environment. The constant circulation of air carries sounds throughout the building in unexpected ways. Conversations from distant rooms, equipment alarms from other floors, the general murmur of institutional life. After 9 years working night shift in the cardiac care unit at St. Joseph's Medical Center, I had learned to filter out most background noise and focus on the sounds that mattered for patient care. But the whispers that began emanating from the ventilation system demanded attention. It started subtly during quiet periods when I was completing patient charts at the nurses' station. Soft voices carried through the air conditioning vents, barely audible above the mechanical hum of the hospital's HVAC system. Initially, I assumed I was hearing normal conversation from other units, staff discussing patient care, physicians making rounds, the typical professional dialogue that occurs throughout the night. But the voices were too soft to understand, and they seemed to be coming from directly above my head, rather than from distant locations. When I looked up at the ceiling vent, the whispers would fade, only to resume when I returned to my documentation. "Do you hear that?" I asked Janet, the charge nurse, during a particularly quiet Tuesday night. She paused in her medication preparation and listened carefully. "Hear what?" "Voices from the vents. Like people talking very quietly." Janet listened for another moment, then shook her head. "I don't hear anything unusual, just the normal air circulation noise." But I continued to hear whispered conversations drifting down from the ventilation system. The voices were indistinct but persistent, creating a constant murmur that made concentration difficult during charting periods. After several nights of intermittent whispers, I began to recognize patterns in the voices. There seemed to be multiple speakers, sometimes 2 or 3 individuals engaged in quiet discussion. The tone was conversational, never urgent or alarmed, but too soft to distinguish specific words. "Maybe it's sound transmission from other parts of the hospital," suggested Dr. Martinez during one of his night rounds. Old buildings can have unexpected acoustic properties, but St. Joseph's had been constructed with modern materials and design principles. The ventilation system was specifically engineered to prevent sound transmission between units, ensuring patient privacy and reducing noise pollution. I decided to investigate the phenomenon more systematically. During the following week, I documented the times when whispers were audible, noting any patterns or correlations with hospital activities. The voices appeared most frequently between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., during the quietest period of the night shift. They seemed to originate from the main air intake vent directly above the nurses' station. On Thursday night, the whispers became clearer. I was reviewing lab results for Mrs. Patterson when I heard my own name spoken softly from the ceiling vent. "Nancy is concerned about Mrs. Patterson's potassium levels." I froze, staring up at the ventilation grate. The voice was correct. I had been reviewing Mrs. Patterson's lab work and noting that her potassium was slightly elevated, but I hadn't spoken this concern aloud, and no one else was present to overhear my thoughts. A few minutes later, the whispers continued. "Nancy thinks Mr. Rodriguez needs additional pain medication." Again, accurate. Mr. Rodriguez had been restless, and I was considering whether to contact his physician about adjusting his pain management protocol. But this was an internal clinical assessment I hadn't verbalized. The voices in the ventilation system were somehow accessing my private thoughts and repeating them in soft whispers that only I could hear. "Janet?" I called to the charge nurse. "Are you hearing the voices now?" She approached the nurse's station and listened carefully. "No, Nancy, I don't hear anything. Are you feeling all right?" But the whispers continued, commenting on my nursing assessments and clinical decisions with impossible accuracy. The voices knew what I was thinking before I fully formulated the thoughts myself. "Nancy is wondering if she should check on Mr. Thompson's surgical site." I had been planning to make an additional assessment of Mr. Thompson's incision, but I hadn't written this in his chart or mentioned it to anyone. The voices were monitoring my internal clinical reasoning and providing a running commentary on my thought processes. Over the following nights, the whispers expanded to include observations about other staff members. The voices would comment on Janet's medication calculations, predict Dr. Martinez's treatment decisions, and discuss the concerns of nurses working on other units. Dr. Martinez is going to order additional tests for room 314. Janet is worried about staffing levels tomorrow. The ICU is expecting 2 admissions before morning, all predictions that proved accurate within hours of being whispered through the ventilation system. But the most disturbing development occurred on a Friday night in October. I was documenting routine vital signs when the whispers began discussing a patient death that hadn't yet occurred. Mr. Chen in room 318 will arrest at 3:47 a.m. Cardiac rhythm will change to ventricular fibrillation. Resuscitation attempts will be unsuccessful. Mr. Chen was stable, recovering normally from coronary bypass surgery. His cardiac monitor showed regular rhythm, his vital signs were appropriate, and he had no indications of impending crisis. But the whispers were specific and confident in their prediction. I immediately went to room 318 to assess Mr. Chen personally. He was sleeping peacefully, breathing normally, showing no signs of distress. His cardiac monitor displayed a steady rhythm with no abnormalities. At 3:47 a.m. exactly, Mr. Chen's cardiac monitor began alarming. Ventricular fibrillation, just as the whispers had predicted. The code team responded quickly, but despite aggressive resuscitation efforts, Mr. Chen could not be revived. The voices in the ventilation system had accurately predicted a patient death 30 minutes before it occurred. I reported the incident to administration, describing the whispered prediction and its precise fulfillment. But without witnesses who could hear the voices, my account was met with skepticism and concern about my mental state. Nancy, Dr. Williams, the medical director, said carefully, "Are you experiencing unusual stress? Changes in sleep patterns? Any personal issues that might be affecting your work?" "I'm fine, but the voices in the vents are predicting patient deaths." Dr. Williams arranged for psychiatric evaluation and recommended I take medical leave while the voices were investigated. But the hospital's engineering department found no explanation for sound transmission through the ventilation system. Tiapu. Ductwork is properly sealed, the chief engineer reported. There's no mechanism for voices to carry from other areas of the hospital to your unit's air vents. The HVAC system was thoroughly inspected, cleaned, and tested. Microphones were installed to record any unusual sounds. But the recording equipment detected only normal mechanical noise from air circulation. Yet I continued to hear the whispers, and their predictions continued to prove accurate. Administration eventually sealed the air vents above the nurses' station with solid covers, eliminating any possibility of sound transmission through the ductwork. But the voices persisted, now seeming to emanate from the walls themselves. Nancy, Mr. Williams in room 320 will have complications during dialysis tomorrow. The new admission in room 315 has an undiagnosed bleeding disorder. Mrs. Garcia's. Family should be notified tonight. Each whispered prediction proved correct, providing advance warning of medical crises and patient deaths with consistent accuracy. I eventually requested a transfer to day shift, hoping to escape the voices that seemed to monitor and predict the events of the night shift. But the day supervisor reported similar concerns about my documentation and clinical assessments. Nancy, you're anticipating patient problems with unusual accuracy. How are you identifying these issues before they become apparent to other staff? I couldn't explain that whispered voices were providing advance warning of medical complications. The phenomenon sounded impossible even to me, despite experiencing it directly. I left St. Joseph's Medical Center and accepted a position at a different hospital. But I often wonder if the voices continue to whisper through the sealed ventilation system, providing predictions and insights to nurses who may not realize they're receiving supernatural clinical guidance. Some information, I've learned, travels through channels that exist outside normal communication systems. And sometimes the most valuable clinical insights come from sources we can't identify or explain, carried through hospital infrastructure that connects different levels of reality. The voices taught me to trust clinical intuition that seems to come from nowhere, to pay attention to concerns that arise without obvious cause, and to recognize that patient care sometimes requires listening to guidance that exists in the spaces between thought and knowledge, even when that guidance whispers through ventilation systems that have been sealed to prevent exactly the kind of communication that continues to occur, providing warnings and insights that save lives through impossible means. Patient identification protocols exist to prevent medical errors. Wristbands, verbal confirmation, chart verification, multiple safeguards ensure that every treatment reaches the intended recipient. In my 14 years of oncology nursing at Memorial Cancer Center, I had never encountered a situation where these protocols failed to distinguish between different patients. Until the night Margaret Williams appeared in 2 rooms simultaneously. The evening began routinely. Our unit was operating at 3/4 capacity, with most patients stable and requiring standard overnight monitoring. Margaret Williams was admitted to room 412 for chemotherapy treatment, a familiar patient who had been receiving care with us for 6 months as she battled ovarian cancer. I knew Mrs. Williams well. 73 years old, retired teacher, gentle demeanor despite the challenges of cancer treatment. She always thanked the nursing staff for even minor assistance and maintained remarkable grace throughout her difficult diagnosis. During my 10 p.m. rounds, I checked on Mrs. Williams in room 412. She was resting comfortably, reading a mystery novel, and chatted briefly about her progress through treatment. Her IV was running properly, vital signs were stable, and she expressed no concerns about her condition. "Thank you for checking on me, dear," she said as I prepared to leave. "You nurses are such angels." 20 minutes later, I encountered Margaret Williams in room 418. The same Margaret Williams. Same face, same voice, same mannerisms. Wearing an identical hospital gown, connected to the same type of IV setup, reading what appeared to be the same mystery novel. I stood in the doorway, staring at an impossible situation. Mrs. Williams looked up from her book and smiled with the same warmth I had seen in room 412. "Hello, dear. Thank you for taking such good care of me." "Mrs. Williams," I managed to say. "Yes, that's right. I'm so grateful for all the attention. You nurses work so hard." I checked her wristband. Margaret Williams. Date of birth matching our records. Patient. ID number identical to the woman in room 412. But room 418 was supposed to be occupied by Robert Morrison, a 60-year-old man receiving treatment for lung cancer. I hurried back to room 412. Mrs. Williams was still there, still reading, still looking exactly as she had during my previous visit. "Mrs. Williams, I need to ask you something. Have you left your room tonight?" She looked puzzled. "No, dear. I've been right here reading. Why do you ask?" "Are you sure? You haven't walked down the hall or visited other rooms?" "I'm quite sure. I haven't left this bed since dinner." But Margaret Williams was also in room 418, providing identical responses to identical questions. I called Linda, our charge nurse, to report the situation. She followed me to room 418, where Mrs. Williams greeted us both with her characteristic warmth. "How lovely to see you both. I was just telling this other nurse how grateful I am for the wonderful care." Linda checked the patient wristband and compared it to our census. "This shows Margaret Williams, but room 418 should be Robert Morrison." "Where's Mr. Morrison?" I asked. Linda looked confused. I'm not sure. Let me check the system." But the hospital computer showed Margaret Williams assigned to both room 412 and room 418. 2 identical admissions, same patient information, same medical history, same treatment plan. We brought both women to the hallway simultaneously, thinking that seeing each other might resolve the impossible situation. But when Mrs. Williams from room 412 encountered Mrs. Williams from room 418, both became agitated. "Who is this woman?" demanded the Mrs. Williams from room 412. "Why does she look like me?" "That woman is dangerous," insisted the Mrs. Williams from room 418. "She's been pretending to be me. Don't trust her." Both women displayed identical mannerisms, identical speech patterns, identical concerns about the other's presence. But each insisted that she was the real Margaret Williams and the other was some kind of imposter. "This is impossible," Linda whispered. "People don't duplicate themselves." We separated the 2 women, returning each to their respective rooms, while we tried to determine what was happening. But both continued to insist that the other was a threat, a fake, someone dangerous who was stealing her identity. Dr. Patterson, our oncology attending, arrived within an hour to assess the situation. He examined both women thoroughly, comparing their medical histories, treatment responses, and physical characteristics. "They're identical," he reported. "Same surgical scars, same treatment side effects, same responses to questioning. I can't determine any differences between them. But one of them has to be the real Mrs. Williams," I protested. "Based on what criteria? They both match our medical records perfectly." The night progressed with both Margaret Williamses receiving identical care in their separate rooms. Both required the same medications at the same times. Both experienced the same side effects from chemotherapy. Both expressed the same concerns about treatment and the same gratitude for nursing care. But both continued to warn us about the other. "Please, don't let that other woman near me," pleaded the Mrs. Williams in room 412. "I don't know what she wants, but she's not who she appears to be. You must be careful of that imposter," urged the Mrs. Williams in room 418. "She's trying to take over my life. Don't believe anything she tells you." Neither woman could explain how there could be two of them, but both were adamant that they were real and the other was false. Family members were contacted to help with identification. Margaret's daughter Sarah arrived at 2 a.m., exhausted and confused by our call about her mother's unusual situation. But when Sarah met both women, she couldn't distinguish between them. "They're both my mother," she said, tears in her eyes. "Same voice, same memories, same personality. How is this possible?" Sarah spent an hour with each woman discussing family history, childhood memories, and recent events. Both Margaret Williamses provided identical responses, sharing the same recollections with the same emotional reactions. "Mom," Sarah asked each woman, "tell me about the Christmas when I was 7 and broke your favorite vase." Both women laughed with identical warmth and related the same story with the same details and the same affectionate tone. But when Sarah mentioned the other Margaret Williams, both became protective and concerned. "Honey, please don't trust that other woman," each one warned. "I'm your real mother. That other person is dangerous." As dawn approached, the situation remained unresolved. Two Margaret Williamses continued to exist in separate rooms, receiving identical medical care, expressing identical concerns about each other's presence. But during the 7 a.m. shift change, something changed. The day shift nurse reported finding only one Margaret Williams in room 412, reading her mystery novel as if nothing unusual had occurred. "What happened to the patient in room 418? I asked. "Room 418 is empty. According to the census, it's been unoccupied all night. But I had spent the entire night caring for Margaret Williams in both rooms. Linda had witnessed both women. Dr. Patterson had examined both patients. Sarah had spoken with both versions of her mother. Where's the other Mrs. Williams?" The day shift nurse looked confused. "There's only one Margaret Williams. There's always been only one." The hospital record showed no evidence of dual admissions or multiple patients with the same identity. Margaret Williams appeared in our system once, assigned to room 412, receiving routine oncology care. But in my nursing notes, I had documented identical care provided to 2 different patients in 2 different rooms throughout the night. Medication administration times, vital signs assessments, patient interactions, all recorded separately for room 412 and room 418. Margaret Williams herself had no memory of the duplication. When I asked her about the night's events, she seemed puzzled. "I slept well, dear. Had some lovely conversations with the nursing staff. Nothing unusual at all. Do you remember another woman who looked like you?" "Another woman? No, I don't recall meeting anyone like that." But in my documentation folder, I had 2 complete sets of nursing notes for Margaret Williams, recording care provided simultaneously to the same patient in different locations. I never determined which room contained the real Margaret Williams, or what happened to the other version. Both women had seemed equally authentic, equally deserving of care, equally concerned about the presence of their impossible duplicate. Some patients, I've learned, exist in states that don't conform to normal rules of identity and location. And sometimes, providing compassionate care means accepting that the people we treat might exist in multiple versions simultaneously, each one real and each one requiring the same professional attention. The most important thing, I realized, wasn't determining which Margaret Williams was authentic. It was ensuring that both received excellent nursing care, regardless of how many versions of themselves needed treatment on any given night. Hospital architecture follows predictable patterns. Corridors of standard length, rooms arranged in logical sequences, navigation systems designed for efficient movement of staff and patients. In my 10 years as a psychiatric nurse at Riverside, mental health facility, I had walked every hallway hundreds of times and knew the building's layout with the precision that comes from daily repetition. The corridor connecting the acute care unit to the administrative offices measured exactly 47 feet, 24 paces at my normal walking speed, requiring less than 30 seconds to traverse. I had counted the distance many times during routine transfers and medication deliveries, which is why the night I spent nearly an hour walking that same hallway became so unsettling. It began during a busy Friday evening shift. Census was at capacity, with several patients requiring intensive monitoring due to medication adjustments and behavioral concerns. Around 10:30 p.m., I needed to deliver updated treatment plans to the night supervisor's office at the far end of the administrative corridor, a routine task that I had performed countless times without incident. Entered the hallway at the usual access point, carrying 3 patient files that required supervisory review. The corridor appeared normal. Fluorescent lighting, pale green walls, standard institutional flooring. But as I began walking, something felt different about the distance. The hallway seemed longer than usual. Not dramatically longer, just subtly extended, as if the far end were receding slightly with each step I took. I continued walking at my normal pace, expecting to reach the supervisor's office within the usual time frame, but the door didn't appear. After what felt like several minutes of walking, I stopped and looked back. The entrance to the acute care unit was no longer visible behind me. The hallway stretched in both directions, seeming to extend far beyond the building's actual dimensions. I continued forward, thinking I must have become disoriented or taken a wrong turn somehow. But there were no intersecting corridors, no alternate routes, no way to have deviated from the straight path between the acute care unit and the administrative offices. Just an impossibly long hallway that seemed to stretch indefinitely in both directions. My footsteps echoed strangely in the extended space. The sound bounced off the walls with a hollow quality that suggested the corridor was much larger than the 47-foot distance I knew it to be. The fluorescent lights hummed with a deeper tone, as if they were illuminating a space significantly longer than designed. I checked my watch. 10:47 p.m. I had been walking for 17 minutes, far longer than the 30 seconds required to cross the normal hallway. But the supervisor's office remained out of sight. The walls looked identical to the familiar corridor. Same paint color, same institutional fixtures, same scuff marks at wheelchair height. But the space between them had somehow expanded, creating a hallway that defied the building's architectural specifications. I decided to turn around and return to the acute care unit, thinking I could take an alternate route to the supervisor's office. But when I turned, both directions looked identical. The hallway extended endlessly in front of me and behind me, with no indication of which way led back to familiar territory. The fluorescent lights created pools of illumination that repeated in a rhythm that should have ended after 47 feet. But the pattern continued indefinitely, lighting a corridor that had no apparent terminus in either direction. I chose a direction and began walking more quickly, hoping to reach some recognizable landmark. But my increased pace only emphasized the impossible length of the hallway. Each step should have brought me closer to an exit, but the corridor continued unchanged. The echo of my footsteps created a rhythmic pattern that seemed to multiply as it bounced off the walls. Soon I was hearing not just my own steps, but what sounded like dozens of people walking in the same corridor, all maintaining the same pace, all moving in the same endless space. I stopped walking to listen more carefully. The echoing footsteps continued for several seconds before fading to silence. But in that silence I could hear something else, distant voices, as if other people were trapped in the same impossible hallway, calling for help from locations I couldn't identify. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed endlessly, bouncing between the walls and creating multiple overlapping responses that made it impossible to determine if anyone was actually answering me. I resumed walking, trying to maintain a steady pace while fighting the growing panic that came with being lost in a space that shouldn't exist. The patient files I was carrying felt heavier with each step, and I realized I was beginning to perspire despite the normal temperature of the hallway. After what felt like another 30 minutes of walking, I began to see wear patterns on the floor that suggested heavy foot traffic. The linoleum showed scuff marks and slight depressions that indicated many people had walked this exact path repeatedly. But Riverside Mental Health Facility's administrative corridor rarely experienced heavy traffic. The hallway was used primarily by staff making occasional trips between units, not for regular patient movement or public access. The wear pattern suggested that people had been walking this extended hallway for years, wearing paths in the flooring. Through countless traversals of an impossibly long space, I checked my watch again. 11:23 p.m. I had been walking for 53 minutes, covering what should have been a 30-second journey. My legs were beginning to ache, and I could feel blisters forming on my feet from the extended walking. But the hallway continued unchanged, offering no exit, no intersection, no indication that I was making progress toward any destination. Finally, in desperation, I tried running. Perhaps speed would allow me to cover the extended distance more quickly and reach the supervisor's office before the end of my shift. But running in the endless hallway created a disorienting effect. The fluorescent light streaked past in a blur, but the walls remained stationary, as if I were running in place while the lighting system moved around me. The echoing of my running footsteps became overwhelming, creating a thunderous noise that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. I stopped running and pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the sound of my own movement multiplied into cacophony. When the echoes finally faded, I found myself standing at the entrance to the supervisor's office. The familiar door, the nameplate I had seen hundreds of times, the normal ending point of the administrative corridor. As if I had walked the usual 47 feet and arrived at my intended destination without incident. I checked my watch. 10:32 p.m. According to the time display, I had been walking for exactly 2 minutes, the normal duration for delivering files to the supervisor's office. But my legs ached as if I had been walking for hours. My feet felt swollen and sore inside. My shoes. When I looked down, I could see that my normally white nursing shoes were scuffed and worn, with the soles showing significant wear patterns that hadn't been there at the beginning of my shift. I delivered the patient files to the night supervisor, who accepted them without comment. She seemed unaware that anything unusual had occurred. "Thanks, Sarah. Any problems with the transfers?" "No problems," I replied, though my voice sounded shaky even to myself. When I returned to the acute care unit, I looked at the hallway I had just traversed. 47 feet of standard institutional corridor, exactly as it had always been. But my shoes told a different story, worn through at the soles, scuffed beyond recognition, showing evidence of extended walking on surfaces that had somehow abraded the material. I changed into backup shoes from my locker and disposed of the worn pair, unable to explain how 2 minutes of walking had destroyed footwear that had been nearly new at the beginning of my shift. Over the following weeks, I avoided the administrative corridor whenever possible, finding alternate routes for delivering paperwork and consulting with supervisors. But sometimes the direct route was necessary, and I always approached it with anxiety. The hallway appeared normal on subsequent trips. Standard length, familiar duration, no unusual extension or temporal distortion. But I began carrying a backup pair of shoes in my locker just in case. Other staff occasionally mentioned unusual experiences in the administrative corridor, feeling disoriented during routine trips, taking longer than expected to reach destinations, experiencing fatigue after short walks. But no one reported anything as dramatic as my extended journey through impossible space. I've come to think of the long hallway as a place where distance becomes relative, where the physical architecture of the hospital occasionally expands to accommodate needs that exist outside normal time and space. Perhaps some destinations can only be reached by walking farther than seems possible, wearing out our shoes on paths that exist in the spaces between where we start and where we think we're going. The psychiatric wing, after all, is designed to help people navigate mental spaces that don't conform to normal rules. Maybe it makes sense that the building itself occasionally defies conventional architecture, creating corridors that require more walking, more time, and more persistence than standard construction would suggest. Some distances, I've learned, can't be measured in feet or paces, and some journeys leave evidence on our shoes even when our watches insist that hardly any time has passed at all.